Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Caroline Hardaker about her novel Mothtown. If you haven't checked out part one, please listen or watch that first. In the second part, we continue our discussion of some of the key themes of the novel. We talk about neurodiversity, we talk about the nature of communication, and the idea of home. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and if you do enjoy it, please consider liking the video. Welcome back to my discussion on Mothtown with the author Caroline Hardaker. If you haven't seen the first part, please do check that out first. So we talked about the main themes of the novel and about ideas of communication in particular. But one thing that struck me is a scene quite early in the novel where David feels very overwhelmed. It takes place in a car park during a shopping trip, out in a kind of busy public place. And I was wondering if you'd written him as neurodivergent. Was that a deliberate choice, or is it just something, part of the sort of broader complex of themes that are going on?
It's a tricky question. I would say I was keen when I was writing it for David not to particularly be labeled as anything
Mm,
because he doesn't label himself. He is
mm,
undiagnosed. I think potentially yes. And a lot
mm,
of the reviewers and reviews that I've
mm,
had who have been neurodivergent themselves
mm,
do strongly believe that David is neurodivergent. And yes, he
right.
does have many, many traits of a neurodivergent person.
Mm,
For instance, the examples that you explained, so when he gets overwhelmed in a public setting,
mm,
or, struggles with the body language, struggles with his communication, decides to create alternate ways to
mm,
communicate, um, and being misinterpreted, and his feeling of alienness that he experiences throughout the novel, and
mm,
that kind of fuels his journey throughout the book to find out what happened to his grandfather and ultimately find inverted commas home, which
mm,
is his main pursuit in the novel.
yeah.
He's one trying to find out what happened to his grandfather, but he's also trying to find somewhere where he feels like he truly belongs.
Mm,
But similarly, the when we see him as an adult and as a child, a lot of his character is a result of the trauma he's experienced as a child in this
mm,
unresolved death, unprocessed death,
mm,
unresolved trauma at the strange things happening in the news, which, even though his parents are trying to hide from him, it does pervade through society everywhere he looks. So the school gates have huge padlocks on the door. After school clubs have huge padlocks on the door. There's a bit where he is in the playground on his own and he's listening to a bunch of younger children sort of singing a sort of nursery rhyme about disappearances and people
mm,
being transformed into things. So there's this eerie sense of dread in society
mm,
and a lack of people talking to each other. And I think it can be construed either way. In my mind, yes, he probably is neurodivergent
mm,
as well. And I did think about it when I was writing the novel, but it wasn't my intention to write a book about a neurodiverse narrator. It's just
mm,
the way that David grew in my mind. I often
mm,
start writing because I don't have a plot I want to follow. I have a theme I want to explore. And as I
mm,
said before, the theme of this one was someone who couldn't communicate, and who really struggled. And then from that, the first thing that happens is I tend to build an idea of a character. And then I always say my novels aren't, they're not necessarily plot driven. There's a plot, but they're not plot driven. They are about the character, the journey a character takes through a situation rather than a journal about a situation.
mm,
So David grows as I wrote that first draft. And then as I redrafted, he grew further and further and
mm,
gets built out into this fully fleshed out person who is just as multidimensional as the rest of us are.
mm,
So I don't tend to want to label him straightforward as neurodiverse because I
mm,
don't particularly as well feel like I fit that label.
mm,
I'm very complicated in my own way, and who knows
mm,
what other people might think. But
mm,
I don't feel like I fit them all, so I potentially couldn't convey it in a way enough for me to clearly say he is neurodiverse. But
mm,
that is up to a reader if people feel like akin to David in some way. And there's a lot of readers who felt like they understood his point of view
mm.
and the spiraling he goes on. And if those people want to label him, then great. I'm glad that people can relate to him in some
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
So it's a bit of a cop answer, but I think
Mm,
I I often say when you've written a novel, it's only half the job done in a way.
mm,
I'm a big advocate for that death of the author after the book has been written and the
mm,
rest of it being picked up by the reader. So if you and I read the same book, we might feel like we have the same plot and the same story from that, but we'll have
mm,
a completely different story in our heads from that novel.
mm.
So the reader has a big part to play in it. And
Yeah.
I love that. I love
Mm,
that. It's magic.
yeah.
Yeah.
I did a talk recently on books with neurodivergent representation, and I think it was somebody was talking about responses to Sally Rooney's novels and how
Yeah.
neurodiverse readers has responded and just saying that that writer is neurodiverse, really like sort of leapt on
Yes.
it. So that
Yeah.
indicates, I think, a desire maybe to have that representation. I don't have empirical evidence of this, but it does seem to me to be becoming more common.
It yes, there is more and more.
Mm,
I think from an industry perspective, I think as well, publishers are keen to get more stories out from neurodiverse perspectives,
mm,
simply because there are more people identifying as neurodiverse than there ever have been before.
mm,
But yeah, in the example of Sally Rooney, that's an interesting one because there
mm,
are an awful lot of people who would never read that into the novels. The
mm,
language is very stilted and
mm,
it feels very staid, but that's almost an artistic choice to one reader. It's just
mm.
to create a sense of mood, whereas someone else would interpret that as these are people who aren't relaxed, they aren't
Yeah.
natural in a situation.
Mm,
So it's a really good and popular example because
mm,
it's talked about so much. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
mm. And I mean, in your answer, you mentioned home, and I
Yeah.
think the idea of home and going home features very heavily in Mothtown. What
Mm.
is home in that novel? That's a very difficult question or
It's a
abstract
big
question,
one.
maybe. Mm,
um, yeah, it's a word that appears throughout the novel frequently. And in fact, towards the end, there's even a sort of institute that David becomes involved with, the Society of Home Finders, who take on the word, take ownership of the word too. For David, home at the beginning of the novel was his granddad.
mm,
Home was his granddad and his granddad's office, and anywhere where he felt relaxed, felt like he was understood and loved and accepted, and also where he loved and understood and accepted the rules around him too.
mm,
After his granddad dies, he really struggles to find those things anywhere. So he
mm,
does not feel at home. He feels, in his own words, like an alien, like another
mm,
species. And for quite a bit of the book, he thinks it's him that's the problem, and that because of his interest in insects and also his grandfather being quite into the research of dark matter, he's a scientist,
mm,
he starts to wonder whether he's been born in the wrong form and maybe he is another creature. But then there's a break somewhere in the book when he's an adult where he realizes that actually maybe it's not him that's the problem.
mm,
Maybe he hasn't been born in the wrong skin, he's been born in the wrong world.
mm,
And as a result, he then goes on a bit of a journey to wonder where these mud men are walking off to when he's a child, where his granddad might have disappeared to, where the people in the news have disappeared to, whether
mm,
these people are actually just like him and
mm,
trying to find home somewhere. Um, further reiterated by the fact that he felt like his granddad was just like him, and he has also disappeared, just like
mm,
these people on the news. So throughout the novel, David is desperate to find home, and that's
mm,
basically peace, love, and somewhere where he can be himself.
mm,
And it's just very sad that he doesn't feel like that comes
mm,
from anywhere in the world. There is a point in the adult aspect of the book where he feels he has found someone, a girl called Agatha,
mm,
who works in a shopping arcade near him, and
mm,
who there's sort of a glimmer of hope that she could be his home.
mm.
But yet again, it's up to the reader later on in the novel to find out how much of that is just David's desperation or his clinging to or his misunderstanding of
Yeah,
Agatha. Um, he has quite sad, sad truth for David.
that
We
was
all seek
the
this
really
though,
upsetting
don't we?
part of
We
the
all.
novel for me, actually. That was,
It's
yeah,
sad. Yeah,
yeah,
I know. It was an extra little twist there, but I think we all do it, don't we? We all spend our lives, I think, trying to build a sense of home. And it's not just the worlds around you, because David spends a lot of time in his technical home. He spends it in his flat, in his parents' house, and later in the novel even starts constructing a home of sorts within
mm,
his flat in order to transform into himself. Um, but those things aren't home at all. A home is the way you feel.
yeah,
And so many of us are searching for that. It
mm,
doesn't matter how old we are or how young we are.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, that brings us back to this sort of combination of alienation and communication. And just want to focus a bit on this idea of communication a bit more
Mm,
specifically than we talked about in the first part. So there are some really interesting ideas about language in the book, um, with characters developing and using alternative forms of communication. You mentioned things like insect clicks, for example. In other cases, preferring silence to speech.
mm,
Now, given that, this sort of ill-defined problem is labeled as the modern problem in the novel, can we say, you know, I think you touched on this idea of cause and effect already. Did those aspects of the novel come out of specific features of our real contemporary world? And you mentioned actually much of it was written during COVID when communication was hard. Or, is there a more basic and intuitive need in some people at least to find ways to communicate outside conventional language?
mm. It's both, really.
Mm,
So, yes, COVID had an impact, though I didn't realize it so much at the time. It's just in retrospect.
mm,
But before that, I had it in my mind the disconnect that technology adds to our sense
mm,
of communication. So that COVID was just a big living demonstration of that.
mm,
But prior to that, it was a look at the sort of dissolving of the community setting
mm,
that used to be so prevalent in society,
mm,
and had to be that way because there was no other way of communicating with people, and that was people relied on each other more for support. Um, so I was essentially looking at that at the beginning, and the
mm,
street that David lives on is quite a relatable one to a lot of people. It's just a sort of suburban looking
mm,
village, a long street of houses, but when he's on the street, he sees a lot of older people, which is very much like the little area that I grew up in. It was like a
mm,
new build place in the 80s,
mm,
and people stayed there their whole lives. And now it's a very aging, greying
mm,
community full of people looking out of the windows and not connecting to people.
mm,
Few of them might be sort of flower arranging or something on the windowsills,
mm,
looking after their plants, and that is the only element of touch that they might have in their lives. I think David describes it, or maybe I just describe it as like a bit like they're in a zoo and
mm,
everybody is kept apart by their walls, just watching each other, not actually communicating at all.
mm,
So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is this more unspoken communication that we share on a daily basis. And that comes down to touch
mm,
and subconscious body language. And I'm lacking the words to describe it, but those are the sort of things that David does never experience the understanding of in
mm,
his life. And those are the things that we missed out on during COVID. We weren't
mm,
able to pick up these unspoken things. So I know, for example, when we finally started to go back to seeing people, there
mm,
was this strange feeling of when you met somebody that I know from my perspective, when I was speaking to colleagues every day via Zoom, and then I
mm,
got to be in the room with them, it was like we were strangers again.
mm.
And it was like how they moved and
Yeah.
how they portrayed and the mask that they were wearing, it was completely different. It was like
Mm.
having a completely different conversation with somebody.
Well, and
And
again,
that isn't very,
a
yeah,
lot of those
it was
first
really,
meetings, there was still restrictions,
yeah,
of course, as well. So it
yeah,
was this kind of constrained, you're back in this physical presence, but
yes,
can't, plastic walls everywhere. Yeah, it was very odd, wasn't it?
exactly. Yeah, there was still a lot of barriers. And also, in that case, there was also a lot of guilt as
Mm,
well, because guilt that we hadn't been together, but also when you started to get together with people, there was a guilt that you were even getting together as
mm,
well. Is this definitely necessary? Is this 100? Should we be doing this? Is somebody vulnerable? Is someone at risk? And that added a big
mm,
barrier between us and people as well. And it was interesting how I never thought that it had a portray had a like a result on the novel, but it just
mm,
really did.
mm,
Um, I think also when I was writing it and started to understand David better and the insularness of his character as a result of him not able to connect to other people, I then explored the whole area of how he starts to fabricate and create his own reality around him as a
mm,
result of that. And that, as a result, just it sort of pulled him even further away from everyone else
mm,
because he couldn't share that with them. And then they, in turn, understood him even less. And he
mm,
even wanted to engage with them less because his version of the world became this surrealist one, which was more dangerous and threatening and sad as
mm.
well. So there's a lot of different layers to it, I
Yeah.
guess. But I'm quite, I think a lot of my writing does look at communication in those
Mm,
ways, whether it's also how we tell our story.
mm,
A lot of what I do is first person.
mm,
Pretty much all of my fiction so far, by long fiction, has been first person or multiple first person narrative. But I'm just so interested in how we talk about ourselves to
mm.
people and how we
Yeah.
convey ourselves to people. Brilliant.
And you've led very nicely onto the last question I want to ask, which is it's a scary novel in many ways. But for me, at least reading it, actually, the most frightening thing wasn't so much the grotesque elements as it was the idea that we might be creating and living in a delusional world. I mentioned the term
Mm,
gaslighting earlier, and I think it's a term that probably gets a bit overused these days. But of course, when one person is deliberately trying to manipulate another person's reality for nefarious purposes, that's inexcusable. Now, there are elements of that in Mothtown, but it also seems to be that the novel paints a more complex picture of the way that we believe in certain ideas, certain worlds, and certain realities. And maybe we're creating those realities not for malicious reasons, but simply because we bought into a particular narrative, maybe because we just feel alienated. So, could you say a
mm.
little bit about this aspect of the novel to finish off?
To a degree, we all do it. There's a lot. I think the more thoughtful you are about the world, the more we do this, and we probably don't realize that we're doing it.
Mm,
But it's the nature of the unexplained nature of the universe. It's
mm,
full of gaps.
mm,
And whoever we are, we're always trying to give ourselves meaning and give our lives meaning and some sort of structure.
mm,
The novel, I suppose this element of the novel can be split into two. So on one hand, there is the gaslighting element of the exploitation of more vulnerable people.
mm,
Um, in terms of the exploitation of them for money. That does appear in the novel too. That's a bit more of an opaque exploration of it, but it does demonstrate just how easy it is when people are
mm,
desperate for some
mm,
answers, how people can abuse that. In
mm,
terms of David, he seeks to create, we've already said he seeks to create a world where he fits in, but he takes it a step further in terms of trying to build his own world where he
mm,
fits in. And most of us do this by the families that we build, the jobs that we take on, the careers that we try and set out to do, our hobbies, our interests, the films we watch and the books we read. We're
mm,
all building up ourselves, I think, internally and externally
mm,
to make home, but also just build a self.
mm,
David feels unable and disinterested when it comes to those things. So he's not particularly interested in building a career
mm,
or building a social circle
mm,
or trying to find a place in, he lives in England, a nice place in England that he can call his own. He's far more interested in painting the world
mm,
um, in his own colours, and as the novel goes on, tries to literally construct a way to transform himself or the world and create a doorway into somewhere else. And
mm,
I think when he's a child as well, as a sequence where he is, for some reason, he has to accompany his sister to a theatre club, and he is useless in that respect. The drama teacher thinks so. He ends up painting the scenery.
mm,
Um, and it's a simple process of essentially paint by numbers, but he is unable to do that too, and
mm,
is still obsessed with his granddad, who he always pictures wearing the same outfits, orange jumper, so he
mm,
paints the entire thing like that.
mm,
And then the teachers again go crazy at him. The kids
mm.
laugh at him.
Yeah,
Nobody understands what he's doing, and he can't tell them either. But
yeah,
he's literally painting in the only way he sees
mm,
fit. Um, but yeah, it's just and his sister is a good example of the opposite, where she's moved away to London, she lives with a partner, she has a
mm,
successful career, doesn't necessarily portray her as settled and completely happy,
mm,
but she is the quintessential set up person. She
mm,
is successful in David's eyes, unattainable success,
mm.
but they're both trying to do the same thing. It's just they've gone in completely different directions. So yeah, it's a lot to unpack, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for your answers. It's a wonderful novel. You know, fully recommend people go out and read it. So thanks
Thank
for
you.
discussing it, coming on the show. We'll be back for part three, where you'll give your recommendations. You've already mentioned some other I was going to say gender bending, genre bending texts.
He might be.
We'll see. So please join us for part three, where we'll hear Caroline's recommendations.